Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here in Istanbul, so thank you very much for the invitation. So these are my disclosures. And, you know, in the 80s and 90s, investigators from Cleveland, Philadelphia, and New York described this entity that they initially saw in African Americans, and they thought that this was actually a separate entity, relatively rare entity that they call Polipoidal vasculopathy. So we look at the different imaging modalities, and here in fluorescein angiography, you can see that the pattern mimics occult CMV in A and B, but it's rarely useful because you know, you can't really tell if it's PCV or something else. Rarely it may present as a classic CMV, and some papers show that this may have a poor visual prognosis. So fluorescein angiography in the management of PCV is not too useful. Now we look at ICG, and this is the gold standard for the diagnosis of PCV. And here you can see that it depicts polyps in branch vascular network. We need to make a distinction between the SLO and the fundus camera ICGs. So here the polyps, you can see these are the large aneurysmal dilatations of the inner choroidal vasculature, and these are usually visible within the first 6 minutes. And notice that there is a big hyper-senescent lesion which is surrounded by a dark hypofluorescent halo. The confocal system, the SLO, is the gold standard. And here in a comparison, you can see the two images of the same eye. The fundus camera has not that good of a resolution. That's why the sensitivity and specificity in detecting PCV were much lower than the confocal system. There are similar detection rates for polyps for both methods, but the confocal system was more sensitive in detecting the branching vascular network. In ICG, if we look at the polyps, you can see that in some cases they're single, they can become in clusters, they can have a string configuration or pulsatile versus non-pulsatile. And you can see here some examples of those different images. And here you can see a pulsatile polyp, and the importance of this is that some authors consider because they're pulsatile, they're more prone to bleeding. In this series from Japan, about 10% of eye exhibited a pulsatile polypoidal vessel, but not all of them were associated with massive subretinal hemorrhage. Moving on to SDOCT, you can see here that the localization of the polypoidal lesions are in the sub-RP space, and this supports the notion that they represent the variant of type 1 neovascularization. The SDOCT imaging has localized the polyps to type 1 neovascular complexes occurring within or above Bruch's membrane, and the PCV lesions appear to originate from long-standing CMV rather than from the choroidal vascular itself. So we have a problem with the nomenclature, we have a problem with the name in the sense that it's not really choroidal vasculopathy, but it's a variant of type 1 neovascularization. One way of looking at this is if you see the double layer sign that consists of two reflective layers where you have the RPE and another highly reflective layer underneath the RPE, and this is usually in the area of the branching vascular network. The SDOCT can also show increased choroidal thickness and brings us to the concept that PCV is part of the spectrum of pachychoroid neovasculopathy. And in this study here, the comparison between eyes with PCV and AMD, you can see in that column to your left, those are the PCV eyes. You can see the choroidal thickness is rather increased compared to the AMD eyes where the choroidal thickness is rather decreased. But you can also have PCV eyes with normal or subnormal subfoveal choroidal thickness, but you can have extrafoveal choroidal thickening at sites of the polypoidal disease. Here the choriocapillaris and the Sattler layers are attenuated at these locations, but the Haller vessels were markedly located. Here's another example where you can see that. And in this study, where they did a retrospective observational case control study of 51 eyes, The idea was to see whether or not you could just use SD-OCT to diagnose PCV. And they look at these SD-OCT features of PCV, the sharp PD peak, the PD notch, and the hyperreflected lumen with hyperreflected lesions adherent to the RPE. Here are examples of this. So the sharp PD peak and the hyperreflected lumen with the hyperreflective lesions that are adherent to the RPE. And you can see the notch here, shown by the arrow. And you can see that this study from Moorfield showed that the sensitivity was almost 95% and the specificity was almost 93%. Here's a comparison between swept source and spectral domain OCT, looking at those features that I already mentioned. And you can see that there were similar detection rates among both types of machines. However, the swept source OCT was just superior in detecting the chorioscleral interface. This is another study where they looked at the NFOS OCT to try to diagnose PCV, and you can see that the polyps were the roundy structures that are attached to the posterior face of the RPE. Polyps were seen in all the 30 eyes, but the problem was trying to detect the branch vascular networks as they were only seen in 4 eyes of the 30 eyes. With regards to OCTA, the various components of PCV are not always visualized by OCTA because they may be secondary to masking, so if there's too much blood or fibrosis, you're not going to be able to see them. Or they may be secondary to different flow rates. So if the flow rate is either too fast or too slow, you may not be able to detect it. So in essence, you can't replace the ICE quite yet with OCTA. In this small study of 12 patients with PCV, they looked at OCTA and they identified the BVN in all 12 eyes as the hyperflow lesion in the choriocapillaris layer. You can see polyps in 3 eyes as a hyperflow round structure surrounded by a hypointense halo in the choriocapillaris layer, and in the polyps in the other 9 eyes as hyperflow round structures in the choriocapillaris layers. More examples of that, as you can see. And there is another prospective study of a larger study, almost 50 eyes, and they were only able to diagnose the polyps in about 1/3 of eyes and the BVN in a little bit over half of the eyes. So you can see that depending on the population and depending on the different machines that they use, the detection rate varies. So in summary, ICGA remains the gold standard in detecting polyps in the branching vascular network. The SD-OCT findings include the double layer sign, the peak PED, the notch PED, and with OCTA it does not identify most polyps and it identifies most BVNs. So initially PCV was thought to be a distinct condition, but now the power of multimodal imaging has shown it to be a variant of type 1 CMV, and thus some colleagues have tried to rename it as aneurysmal type 1 neovascularization. And I'll leave you with this quote by these authors where they're saying the main lesson to be learned is that as a phenotypic spectrum appears to merit expansion, investigators should pause to consider the possibility that the entity being described is not a disease per se, but a manifestation of many. Thank you very much for your attention.